This is the first of 4 parts of Lecture 3 in the No Coder's Guide to Surviving AI. Lecture 3 is on context engineering with ChatGPT. Follows Lecture 1 on Introduction to Prompt Engineering and Context Engineering. And Lecture 2 which is all about Claude. This now is Lecture 3 on context engineering with ChatGPT. So let me share my screen. Here it is. The learning outcomes we're going to cover here are divided into 4. This lecture covers learning outcome number 1, which is learn how to set up ChatGPT for optimal efficiency, compare the performance of different models. Then the next video will be explaining how to use context engineering in projects with a case study on creating a set of Canvas question banks for the learning management system that we use at our university. Within 30 minutes, once I've got it working, I created 27 different question banks for stratified sampling of quizzes online. The third video is the custom GPT library, just a survey of that and picking out some of my favorites. Case study there is using Excel AI. And lastly, we cover developing context engineering using GPT Builder to create a custom GPT, which you could also publish if you've got a Pro or Plus subscription. And the case study is about that Socratic learning tool that I made a while ago and posted on LinkedIn. So this is the first part. It's about GPT settings and GPT models and modes within different models. So it's really important to get the personal settings correct when you start using GPT. Even if you're just a free user, you can still use the simplest form of context engineering, which is the custom instructions. They're in the personalization settings, and they produce, if you use them, a consistent response more appropriate to your needs. And there are other instructions that you can use. In particular, you can give project instructions, and you can have instructions within custom GPTs. So all these instructions aim to shape the tone that they use when they respond to you, the depth of their responses, the sort of format that the responses are in. Is it in a set of bullets, or is it just long loads of texts and so forth? Are there links or not? And also the role alignment. Is the GPT talking to a lawyer, or is it talking to a cook making recipes? So you need to tell the GPT who you are and what type of responses you want. Because without it, you just get the model's default settings. And as we go through different models in GPT, you'll see that different models have different tone, depth, format, and so forth. So if you want to get some simple examples, you could say, be as concise as possible, or explain things step by step using logical deductions. You can either have a very short or very long response. And the level of the response, you could say, explain things to a school child or to a third-year student in finance or something like that. And then when you define your role, you could specifically say, I'm preparing for an exam in blockchains and crypto assets or something like that. So a lot of the responses will be geared towards that. So how do you make your custom instructions? Well, when you click the box, you go down to the left-hand corner of the screen where your account is. You click that. At the moment, you can also see custom instructions straight away, but they change the interface all the time. So you may just have to go into settings, and then you'll find custom instructions. And there'll be two fields. The first field is what traits should GPT have? They ask that question. And that's where you set the tone, whether you want it to be precise, formal, collaborative, that sort of thing. You set its behavior, you set the formatting. I use a lot of latex, for example. You can do things like, how do you emphasize things? Should you use bold text or red or things like that? Bullet points and so forth. And then anything else that GPT should know about you. So you can talk about your role. I'm a university lecturer, or I'm a student of some level. Your tasks, what you're trying to do, whether you're preparing an essay or you're writing a journal paper, etc., etc. And your preferences. For example, use UK spelling, not US. And one of the things I have to say again and again, I am not Welsh. Well, actually, I'm half Welsh. My dad was Welsh. But when I use speech to text, GPT is forever translating my voice into Welsh. And I can't stop it doing it. I asked why it does it, and apparently I have some, I don't know, vowel sounds that are a bit Welsh. It's very, very odd. So I have to keep telling it that I'm not Welsh. I don't speak Welsh. So here's some examples of good and bad custom instructions. So you could say, be helpful and friendly, talk like a human, not like a robot. Give me information about, I don't know, aubergine recipes. It's much better if you be much more specific. One of the best things to say, actually, is ask clarifying questions before responding fully, because otherwise it tends to go off on its own. And particularly in GPT-5, if you've got the auto button switched, it'll just go straight into thinking mode, and it's just going to use up an awful lot of electricity. So I always put, not only in my custom instructions, but in project instructions, in GPT instructions when I'm building them, ask questions before responding fully. And you should be as concise, structured, and rigorous as you can, according to the level of the user. Obviously, you don't want to be too rigorous if it's a school child. Another thing is that GPT uses a lot of filler phrases, very long sentences, lots of adjectives. And it's you can tell the style of GPT. So you could try to set the traits. And that's something I'm going to show you in, I think it's lecture 3, where the tone can be very easily altered. But I'll save that for lecture 3. And in terms of the user context, you can just say, I'm a student who needs help revising exams, or I'm writing something about crypto markets. Much better to be more specific, say I'm a master's student taking fintech and financial risk management, or I use AI tools to help with my online assessments, 3,000 word essay, something like that. So depending on who you are, if you're an educator, your traits might be concise, clear structures, use latex for documents. I mean, this is just very basic stuff. And obviously, custom instructions can be much longer, but it may be a good idea to put it through Anthropic Console, as I showed you at the beginning of lecture 2, to make sure that it's efficiently produced before you upload the custom instructions. And the same with any instructions. Anthropic Console is very good at making things precise. And then you talk about me. I'm writing lectures on context engineering in large language models at the moment. So, I'm a lot of my use is geared towards that until next month when I start teaching at university. It'll be quite different. You could be a student. You want long explanations with chain of thought. That's step-by-step reasoning. Or you could be researcher, where you want a lot of detail, you want references, and you could be writing a paper on, say, blockchain technologies. So there'd be a lot of computing background to put in about you there. So when you go into GPT, you'll see the default setting in the UK at the moment is 5. And then if you click that down arrow there, you'll see auto, where it flicks in a multimodal way between different models, or you could just do GPT-5 instant, or that's if you want very quick fact checks, or thinking mini, when you do want thinking, but you don't want it to go off for hours and hours, just for simple tasks, thinking mini. But I find that on the auto, the thinking mode is very, very often flipped into, and you can skip it because it'll say thinking for better, thinking longer for better answer, and underneath you can skip that if you want. It's very token heavy, okay? So you remember the tokens are not only the number of words you use and symbols and things when you put in your prompt, and also when it gives its response. So if it gives a short prompt, very long response, that's already very token heavy, but you also, the processing tokens that it uses when it's thinking, it could be thinking for minutes, and that's using a lot of tokens as well. The pro option, I'm not covering in these videos. This is for research requiring much more reliability. If you use the API connection where you're charged via the number of tokens you actually use, but I'm not covering that. This is really for Plus subscribers like me that now have to pay not £18 a month, but £20 a month. It's just gone up, but still it's worth it. And then there is these legacy models, 4.0, sorry, not 4.0, 4.0. 4.0 was the predecessor to 4.1, but that's not available now. It's 4.0, letter O, which I like a lot. I'll explain the difference between these. 03 and 04 mini, I don't use that much, but I do use 4.0 and 4.1, and they're better for some tasks. So the pros of 4.0 is that it's very fast, it's lightweight, everyday use, and it's got a really nice default conversational style. It's not too GPT-ish. But the cons are it doesn't have quite such strong reasoning compared with 4.1 or 5, which is much stronger. And its temperature is quite low, or is it high? High temperature means lots of variability. Yeah, so it's got high temperature. In other words, it's quite stochastic in its outputs. It's not very consistent particularly in technical outputs. It can give very different responses. And then GPT 4.1 is stronger on the reasoning, as I said. It's got a larger effective context window. So, you know, the context window is how much information the GPT apparently remembers, but it doesn't actually remember, because what happens is every time you make a prompt, it will send not only that prompt, but all the history before it again. And there's only a certain number of tokens that can go into its effective memory. So, for example, if you were to load a file which was really large, then you would have to drop some of the earlier prompts to accommodate that file in your context window allocation, because there's a limit how much megabytes can be in that. And it could be that those early prompts are really setting the whole thing up. So I'll be talking about that later on when I talk about projects and how to efficiently context engineer when you're using a project in quite some depth. So GPT-1 is slower than 4.0. It has more computation demands. That's why it's got a bigger context window. And now what about GPT-4 versus GPT-5? Well, GPT-4 has been tested for longer, so it's more predictable. And 4.1 has some pretty stable outputs, not so much 4.0, but 4.1 does. It feels much lighter. It is faster for everyday tasks. The pros of GPT-5 are it has some pretty deep reasoning in the thinking mode, although I get a bit frustrated with that sometimes. And also OpenAI says it is faster, but it can be very unpredictable. It can be very slow in the thinking mode. But then there are cons with GPT-4 as well. It's not always good at tackling complex problems, And some of the older models, they don't take text, images, audio, all in one sort of multimodal. You can upload what you like. They're very restricted in their file types. So are responses faster in GPT-5 than GPT-4? I often find not. The way you measure responses is something called TTUC, time to useful content. In other words, how long does it take between your prompt and actually getting the full reply? Because you may see lots of things, now researching that, now I'm processing this, etc., etc. But when you get the useful content, GPT does use fewer tokens than GPT-4. So it's very effective in its inference sequences. As long as it's not thinking too hard, particularly in the thinking light mode, the inference sequences are much shorter. So you have a reduced time to useful content. And the problem, though, is that GPT-5, when you're in auto mode, it has a dynamic router. It can switch a task to the main, the thinking, the mini, or the nano modes, whereas GPT-4 is, it's not going to switch between modes, and that, on average, means that it is slower. But when it comes to the reported speed, some developers have been testing this, and I've found it as well, that GPT-5 can take like 30 to 70 seconds versus for the same task 2 or 3 seconds in GPT-4. Well, it depends how complex the tasks are. So for some of my work, I go back to GPT-4, depending on the task. Finally, and this is the last slide in the video, hallucination is no better in GPT-5 than it was in GPT-4. OpenAI says that the hallucinations are less, whereas 4.0 was hallucinating a lot, like almost 13% of responses included hallucinations. Not entirely sure how they tested that, but I tested it with a prompt like, give me a list of 10 pharmaceutical firms who have developed technology products, which of course none of this is true. But here are 10 firms. Propeller Health by GlaxoSmithKline and Novartis has apparently developed a digital inhaler sensor and a mobile app for asthma and COPD management. And it doesn't exist, nor do any of these exist. So you've got to be careful. This hallucination is not going to go away. It's not nearly as bad in Claude. It's one of the good things about Claude, because it's a very different model. It's not a GPT. It's built with different LLM principles, and it doesn't hallucinate as much. So that's it for this lecture. That's the next lecture, and I will stop the video here.